I've always believed that silence holds more truth than words ever could. Perhaps that's why I noticed Claire before she ever spoke to me. The way she carried quiet around her like a protective cloak. The way her eyes held conversations her lips would never dare to have. It was October when she first walked into the university library, where I worked nights to pay for my graduate studies in literature. The autumn rain had been relentless that week, turning the campus into a watercolor painting of amber and rust, and students hurried past the tall windows with their shoulders hunched against the cold. But Claire moved differently. She drifted between the stacks like she belonged to the silence itself, her fingers trailing along book spines with a reverence that made my chest tighten. I pretended to organize returns while watching her. Dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, occasionally catching the warm light from the reading lamps. She wore an oversized navy sweater that seemed to swallow her whole, and when she finally selected a book, Virginia Woolf's The Waves, I felt something shift in my understanding of loneliness. She checked out the book without making eye contact, her voice barely above a whisper when she thanked me. But her fingers brushed mine as I handed her the receipt, and the contact sent electricity through my entire body. I watched her disappear into the rain, clutching the book against her chest like a shield. That night, I couldn't focus on my thesis about queer subtext in modernist literature. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was writing about hidden desires and unspoken truths while my own heart hammered with recognition of something I'd been trying to name for months. Claire's presence had stirred something that felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering a dream just before waking. I found myself staying later at the library, hoping she'd return. The other graduate students who worked there, mostly James and Oliver from the English department, teased me about my sudden dedication to evening shifts. They didn't understand that I was waiting for something I couldn't yet articulate. Claire came back 3 days later, returning The Waves and selecting Orlando. I began to see the pattern in her choices. Always Virginia Woolf. Always something that danced around the edges of identity and transformation. She was reading her way through a journey I recognized but had never had the courage to take myself. Each visit lasted exactly 47 minutes. I know because I started timing them, not in any creepy way, but because I needed to understand the rhythm of her presence. She would arrive at 7:13 p.m., browse for 17 minutes, read in the corner armchair by the philosophy section for exactly 30 minutes, then check out her selection and disappear back into whatever life waited for her beyond these walls. I began to build a picture of her from these fragments. The way she unconsciously tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking deeply. How she always chose the same chair, the one slightly hidden behind the tall shelves where the afternoon light couldn't quite reach. The careful way she turned pages, as if each word were something precious that might break under careless handling. During the 4th week of this routine, something changed. I was shelving books in the poetry section when I heard a soft intake of breath from Claire's usual corner. When I peered around the shelf, I saw her holding Mrs. Dalloway, open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was crying. Not the dramatic tears of heartbreak or frustration, but the quiet, steady tears of recognition. The kind that come when you see yourself reflected in someone else's words and realize you're not as alone as you thought. My heart broke and mended itself in the same moment. I wanted to go to her, to offer tissue or comfort or just silent company. But something held me back. Maybe the understanding that some moments are too sacred to interrupt, or maybe my own fear of what might happen if I acknowledged what I was feeling. Instead, I watched her cry over Virginia Woolf's words about love and loss and the complexity of human connection, and I fell in love with her grief as much as her grace. My abuela always said that love speaks its own language, one that doesn't need words to be understood. She'd gesture with her weathered hands as she spoke, painting pictures in the air of the romance she'd shared with my grandfather before he died. I used to think she was being romantic and old-fashioned. Now I understand she was simply describing the grammar of glances, the syntax of stolen moments, the poetry of presence. Claire and I developed our own vocabulary over the following weeks. A slight smile when she approached the checkout desk became our greeting. The way she'd pause and look back before leaving was our goodbye. When she started leaving bookmarks in the volumes she returned, never in random places, but always marking passages that felt like messages, I knew we were having a conversation that transcended speech. One bookmark fell from To the Lighthouse, marking the passage about Mrs. Ramsay's dinner party, where Woolf writes about the moment when separate individuals become something larger through shared understanding. I pressed the bookmark between the pages of my own journal that night and read the passage until I'd memorized every word. The first time our eyes truly met and held, I was working late on a particularly quiet Thursday. The library was nearly empty except for a few pre-med students cramming for exams in the basement study rooms. Claire sat in her usual spot, but instead of reading, she was looking directly at me. The moment stretched between us like a bridge neither of us was quite brave enough to cross. Her expression was questioning, vulnerable, as if she was asking permission for something she couldn't name. I felt my face flush with heat, and I had to look away first, busying myself with paperwork that didn't need to be done. But the damage was done. The acknowledgement hung in the air between us now, changing the nature of our silent exchanges. We both knew that something was building, something that would eventually demand more than bookmarks and borrowed glances. November brought early snow and shorter days, but also a new boldness to Claire's visits. She began to linger at the checkout desk, ostensibly asking about library policies or book recommendations, but really just creating reasons to hear my voice and have me hear hers. Her voice was exactly what I'd imagined during all those weeks of silence, low and thoughtful, with a slight rasp that suggested she didn't use it often enough. When she asked about the library's collection of LGBTQ+ literature, the question hung between us loaded with subtext neither of us was ready to address directly. I recommended The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith, my hands trembling slightly as I wrote down the call number. She took the paper from me, our fingers brushing again with that same electric contact, and I watched her eyes widen with what might have been recognition or hope or fear, perhaps all three. That night, I called my abuela for the first time in weeks. She lived 3 states away in the small town where I'd grown up, and her voice carried the warmth of home and unconditional love. I didn't tell her about Claire directly, but I found myself asking about her own love story, hungry for examples of how 2 people find each other across impossible distances. She told me again about the first time she saw my grandfather at a church dance, how he was too shy to ask her to dance, but spent the entire evening watching her from across the room. How she finally approached him herself, scandalized her friends, and how that moment of courage led to 53 years of marriage. Sometimes, Mija, she said, her voice soft with memory, the most important things we do are the ones that scare us most. After we hung up, I sat in my tiny graduate student apartment, staring at the stack of books on my nightstand. Half of them were from the library, volumes Claire had returned that I'd checked out myself just to read the passages she'd marked. I was learning to read her thoughts through her annotations, to understand her heart through her literary choices. It felt like the most intimate relationship I'd ever had.
The transformation
and we'd barely
happened
spoken
slowly,
50 words.
then all at once. Claire began staying later, often until the library closed at 10 p.m. Sometimes I'd find her asleep in her chair, her book fallen open on her chest, her face peaceful in a way that made my heart ache with tenderness. The first time I had to wake her, I approached with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. She opened her eyes slowly, looking confused for a moment before focusing on my face. We were closer than we'd ever been, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to count her freckles. "The library's closing," I whispered, though there was no one else around to disturb. She nodded, gathering her things with careful deliberation, but as she stood to leave, she paused beside me. "Nina," she said, and hearing my name in her voice for the first time was like discovering a new color. "Yes," I managed, though my throat felt tight. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me exist here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every evening we'd shared in silence, every book that had passed between us, every moment of recognition and yearning we'd been too afraid to acknowledge. After she left, I stood alone among the stacks, feeling like I'd been entrusted with something precious and fragile. The library felt different now, not just a place where I worked, but a sanctuary where something rare and beautiful was taking root. But sanctuaries, I was beginning to learn, are only safe until the outside world demands entry. James noticed first, which shouldn't have surprised me. He'd always been observant, especially about things that made good gossip. He cornered me during my shift change on a Tuesday evening, his eyes bright with curiosity and something that looked like concern. "So," he said, leaning against the circulation desk with studied casualness, "who's the girl who's been haunting the literature section?" My face must have given me away because his expression shifted from curiosity to understanding, then to something like pity. James was gay himself, had been out since undergraduate school, and wore his identity with a confidence I'd never quite managed to achieve. "Nina," he said more gently now, "you know she's what?" I interrupted, though I knew exactly what he was going to say. "She's in the closet, sweetie. Deep in it. You can see it from space." The words hit me like cold water, not because they were surprising, but because they made concrete what I'd been trying not to think about. Claire's careful distance, her borrowed literary explorations of identity, the way she seemed to disappear completely between library visits. It all pointed to someone living a divided life. "I'm not." I started then stopped. What could I say? That I wasn't interested in her? That would be a lie. That I wasn't hoping for something more than our silent communion? Another lie. That I didn't understand the complexities of being closeted? That would be the biggest lie of all. James's expression softened further. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I just don't want to see you get hurt." But I was already hurt, I realized. I'd been hurt from the moment I'd started caring about someone whose life I could only glimpse in fragments. Someone who might never be able to love me in daylight. That evening, Claire arrived at her usual time, but something was different. She seemed more fragile, like she was holding herself together through sheer will. She browsed the stacks for longer than usual, picking up books and putting them back, unable to settle on anything. Finally, she approached the desk empty-handed. "I can't find what I'm looking for," she said, and the words seemed to carry more weight than a simple request for help. "What are you looking for?" I asked. She was quiet for so long, I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "A story where it works out," she said, "where they get to be happy." My heart broke for her, for us, for every person who'd ever had to search for their own reflection in stories written by, and for other people. I wanted to tell her that we could write our own story, that happiness didn't have to be something we found in books. But the words felt too big, too dangerous, too likely to shatter whatever delicate thing we'd built together. Instead, I wrote down a call number on a slip of paper and handed it to her. "Try this one," I said. She looked at the paper, then at me, and for a moment I thought she might say something that would change everything. But she just nodded and walked away, leaving me with the echo of her sadness and the weight of my own cowardice. Oliver found me crying in the poetry section the next day. I'd been trying to shelve books, but every title seemed to remind me of Claire, and I'd finally given up and sat on the floor between the stacks, letting the tears come. Oliver was different from James, quieter, more thoughtful. Someone who understood that sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is simply bear witness to someone else's pain. He sat down beside me without asking questions, his presence steady and calming. "Want to talk about it?" he asked after a few minutes. So I told him everything. About the months of silent connection, about the books and bookmarks and borrowed glances, about the note that felt like both a gift and a farewell. Oliver listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let someone know they're not alone, even if it's scary, even if it doesn't lead where we want it to." His words stayed with me through the rest of my shift. That evening, I sat at my desk in my apartment and wrote my own note. Not a declaration of love. That felt too presumptuous, too demanding, but an acknowledgement of what we'd shared, and an invitation to something more if she wanted it. "Dear Claire, your note meant more to me than I can express. The silence we've shared has been precious to me too. But I keep wondering what our voices might sound like together. If you'd like to find out, I'll be at the coffee shop on Elm Street tomorrow at 2 p.m. If not, I understand. And I hope you know that these months of quiet companionship have been a gift I'll treasure regardless. With hope, Nina." I folded the note, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in the copy of Mrs. Dalloway that I knew she'd be looking for. It was a risk that felt both terrifying and necessary, like stepping off a cliff while hoping I'd discover I could fly. I arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, claiming a table by the window where I could watch the street. My hands shook as I stirred my latte, and I checked my phone every 30 seconds despite knowing it was only 1:47 p.m. At exactly 2:03, I saw her walking down the sidewalk. She moved with purpose, but also hesitation, like someone who'd made a decision but was still questioning it. She paused outside the coffee shop, looking through the window, until she spotted me. Our eyes met through the glass, and I saw her take a deep breath before pushing through the door. She approached my table slowly, still wearing that oversized navy sweater that had become so familiar. Up close, in the afternoon light, she was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. But it was her nervousness that made my heart flutter. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the slight tremor in her hands as she pulled out the chair across from me. "Hi," she said, and her voice was different outside the library, less whispered, more real. "Hi," I replied, suddenly aware that this was the first real conversation we'd ever had. She ordered a tea, chamomile, which somehow seemed exactly right, and we sat in silence for a moment, both of us adjusting to the strangeness of being together in daylight, in public, with nothing but our own courage to hide behind. "I've been thinking about your note," she said finally, and I realized that I've been living in the margins of my own life for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something real. The words hung between us, brave and vulnerable and full of possibility. I reached across the table, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. Instead, she met me halfway, her fingers intertwining with mine. Her skin was warm, softer than I'd imagined during all those months of accidental contact. The simple act of holding her hand felt revolutionary, like we were claiming space in the world that had always been denied to us. "I'm scared," she admitted, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. "Me too," I said, "but I'm tired of being scared more than I want to be happy." She smiled, then really smiled, and it transformed her entire face. I realized I'd been seeing her in shadows all this time, and now, in the full light of her joy, she was even more magnificent than I'd dare to hope. That first coffee date lasted 4 hours. We talked about everything and nothing. Her graduate work in social psychology, my thesis on queer literature, our families, our fears, our dreams that we'd never dare to say out loud. Claire told me about growing up in a small conservative town, about the crushing weight of expectations that had shaped her into someone who existed quietly on the edges of her own life. She talked about discovering her sexuality in college, but never finding the courage to act on it. about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who knew her but never really saw her. I share my own story, the daughter of immigrants who'd sacrificed everything for my education, carrying the weight of their dreams alongside my own. I told her about the years of confusion and self-doubt, about finding myself in books before I found myself in life, about the way love had always felt like something that happened to other people. When the coffee shop began to close around us, neither of us wanted the conversation to end. We walked through the campus, taking the long way to nowhere in particular, our hands finding each other in the darkness between streetlights. I keep thinking this is too good to be true, Claire said as we paused beneath a lamppost near the library. What do you mean? This, us, the fact that you see me the way you do. I turned to face her fully, my hands on her shoulders. Claire, I've been seeing you for months. Really seeing you. The way you move through the world like you're apologizing for taking up space. But also the way you light up when you find a passage that speaks to you. The careful way you handle books, like they're sacred objects. The way you cry when something beautiful breaks your heart open. She was crying now, but these weren't the tears I'd witnessed in the library. These were tears of recognition, of relief, of someone who'd been holding her breath for years, finally remembering how to breathe. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I admitted. But maybe we can figure out together. When she kissed me, it was soft and tentative at first, like she was asking a question. I answered by pulling her closer, by letting myself drown in the sweetness of her lips, by pouring months of longing into the space between us. We broke apart breathless, foreheads touching, both of us laughing at the absurdity of all. How we'd spent so many months in silence when we could have been having this conversation all along. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery. We began to map the geography of each other's lives, filling in the spaces that had been blank during our months of silent observation. Claire's apartment was exactly what I'd imagined. Walls lined with books, soft lighting, plants that she tended with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She made tea with ritual precision, her movements graceful and deliberate, and I found myself falling in love with the domesticity of it all. We spent hours reading together, sometimes the same book, sometimes different ones, but always aware of each other's presence. The silence between us was different now, not charged with unspoken longing, but comfortable, companionable, the kind of quiet that comes from being truly seen by another person. I introduced her to my small circle of graduate school friends, watching nervously as she navigated conversations with James and Oliver and the others. But her natural thoughtfulness and genuine interest in people won them over quickly. James, who'd been skeptical about her availability for a relationship, pulled me aside after our first group dinner. I was wrong about her, he said simply. She's not hiding from herself anymore. She's just private, and there's nothing wrong with that. Claire began staying over at my apartment, her presence gradually becoming woven into the fabric of my daily life. I'd wake to find her reading in the kitchen, morning light streaming through the window and catching in her hair. She'd look up when she heard me stirring, smiling with a warmth that made my chest tight with happiness. "Good morning, beautiful," she'd say, and I'd marvel at how easily intimacy had found us, how natural it felt to be loved by her. But even in her happiness, I could sense the weight she still carried. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out windows with a distant expression, or she'd go quiet in the middle of conversations, retreating into herself in ways that reminded me of our library days. The first crack in our bubble of happiness came during Thanksgiving break. Claire had planned to visit her family in Ohio, a trip she'd been dreading for weeks. The night before she left, she was unusually quiet, sitting curled up in my reading chair with a book she wasn't really reading. "Talk to me," I said, settling on the floor beside her chair. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers automatically finding my hair, combing through it with a gentleness that made me want to purr like a cat. "I've never brought anyone home," she said finally. "Never even talked about dating. My parents think I'm just focused on school. And now I have you, and I don't know how to fit that into the world I come from." I understood the weight of that dilemma, the impossible choice between authenticity and acceptance, between living your truth and keeping the peace. My own family had been surprisingly accepting when I finally come out to them. But I knew I was lucky. Not everyone had parents who saw love as love, regardless of gender. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to tell them about you," she said, her voice small but determined. "I want to show them pictures and talk about how happy you make me, and stop pretending that the most important part of my life doesn't exist. But I'm terrified of losing them. They're not bad people, Nina. They're just limited. And I don't know if their love for me is strong enough to overcome their limitations." She left the next morning with a kiss that tasted like goodbye, even though we both knew she'd be back in 4 days. I spent the weekend with my own family, grateful for their warmth and acceptance, but thinking constantly about Claire navigating conversations where she couldn't mention the person who become the center of her world. She called me Tuesday night, her voice thick with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. "How did it go?" I asked, though her tone had already given me the answer. "I told them," she said simply, "about you, about us, about everything." And my mother cried, not happy tears. My father said he needed time to think about it. They asked me not to bring it up again while I was there. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of rejection and the complexity of family love. I wanted to rage at her parents for their small-mindedness, to demand that they see what I saw in their daughter. But I also understood that love isn't always enough to bridge the gaps between different ways of seeing the world. "I'm proud of you," I said finally, because it was the truest thing I could offer her. "It doesn't feel like something to be proud of," she said. "It feels like I've broken something that can't be fixed." "Claire, you didn't break anything. You just refused to keep breaking yourself to fit into spaces that were too small for who you really are." She was crying now, and I wished desperately that I could hold her, could offer more than words across the distance between us. Instead, I talked to her until she fell asleep on the phone, her breathing gradually evening out as exhaustion overcame grief. Claire came back from Ohio changed in ways that were both heartbreaking and beautiful. The careful guardedness that had defined her for so long was gone, replaced by a raw honesty that made her seem both more vulnerable and more powerful. She threw herself into our relationship with an intensity that took my breath away. Where she'd once been hesitant about public displays of affection, she now reached for my hand without thinking, kissed me goodbye in front of other people, introduced me as her girlfriend with a pride that made my heart soar. But I could also see the cost of her newfound authenticity. She called her parents every Sunday, conversations that left her drained and sad. They were polite but distant, asking about her classes and her health, but never mentioning me. As if I were a temporary aberration they could ignore into non-existence. "I keep thinking they'll come around," she told me one evening as we walked through the campus quad, "that they'll realize they'd rather have a happy daughter than a closeted one. And if they don't..." She was quiet for a moment, her breath visible in the cold December air. "Then I guess I'll have to learn to live with the fact that some people can't love all of who I am. But I won't go back to pretending you don't exist. I can't." Her determination was fierce and beautiful, but I could see the toll it was taking. She'd lost weight, dark circles shadowing her eyes, and sometimes I'd catch her staring at her phone, as if willing it to ring with the acceptance she craved. I wanted to fix it for her, to somehow make her parents see what a gift they were throwing away. But all I could do was love her through it, be the soft place she could land when the world felt too sharp and unwelcoming. We created our own traditions that winter. Sunday morning breakfasts that stretched into the afternoon, reading the same book at the same time so we could discuss it over dinner. Long walks in the snow where we talk about everything and nothing. We built a world where we could exist fully as ourselves. And if it was smaller than the one we dreamed of, our physical relationship also entirely unfolded with the same careful attention we'd brought to everything else. Claire approached intimacy like she approached books, with reverence and curiosity, wanting to understand every nuance and hidden meaning. The first time we made love, it was snowing outside, the world muffled and quiet beyond my bedroom windows. She'd been staying over more often, and the anticipation had been building between us like a living thing, electric and patient and inevitable. When it finally happened, it was nothing like the frantic passion I'd read about in novels or seen in movies. Instead, there was a quality of wonder to it, as if we were archaeologists uncovering something precious and rare. Claire touched me like she was reading poetry in a language she was still learning, her fingers tracing stories on my skin that I'd never heard before, but somehow understood perfectly. Afterward, we lay tangled together, her head on my chest, both of us quiet with amazement. I could feel her heartbeat against my ribs, could smell her shampoo, and the faint scent of the vanilla candle I'd lit earlier. The room felt sacred, transformed by what had passed between us. I've never felt this safe with another person, she whispered against my collarbone. Safe how? Safe to be completely myself. Safe to want things. Safe to take up space. I tightened my arms around her, understanding exactly what she meant. With Claire, I felt like I could expand to fill my full size, could want things without apologizing, could love without fear of being too much. Our bodies learn each other's rhythms and preferences, but more than that, we learn to communicate in touches and sighs, and the way we curved into each other during sleep. Sex became another language we spoke fluently, another way of saying things that were too big for words. Spring semester brought new challenges and old fears. Claire's thesis advisor, Dr. Henderson, was a brilliant but traditional woman who'd made her career in academia when being gay was still grounds for dismissal. She'd taken Claire under her wing, and Claire desperately wanted her approval and support for the PhD program she was applying to. The problem was that Dr. Henderson had noticed our relationship, and her disapproval was obvious even when unspoken. She'd grown cooler toward Claire, less available for meetings, more curt in her feedback. Other graduate students in the department began to whisper about how Claire's lifestyle choices might be affecting her academic prospects. I watched Claire begin to close in on herself again, the confident woman who'd emerged after coming out to her parents slowly disappearing back into careful self-protection. She stopped reaching for my hand on campus, stopped meeting me for lunch in public spaces, stopped mentioning me in casual conversations with classmates. It's temporary, she insisted when I confronted her about it. Just until I get into a program. Just until I'm more established. But I could see the familiar patterns reasserting themselves. The way she compartmentalized her life, keeping me separate from the parts of herself that felt vulnerable to judgment. It was like watching someone slowly disappear, even as she stood right in front of me. The breaking point came during a department reception for prospective graduate students. I'd accompanied Claire as her friend, a designation that felt like swallowing glass every time she introduced me. When Dr. Henderson approached us, Claire's entire body tensed. "Claire," Dr. Henderson said, her voice warm but her eyes calculating. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Marcus Peterson from Yale. He's looking for students with your research interests." Claire lit up with professional enthusiasm, launching into a discussion of her thesis work with an energy I rarely saw anymore. I stood beside her, invisible, watching her perform a version of herself that had no room for me in it. Dr. Peterson was charming and interested, and I could see Claire imagining herself in his program, in a world where she could be brilliant and accomplished and safely closeted. When he asked if she was single, She hesitated for just a moment before saying yes. The word hit me like a physical blow. I excused myself and spent the rest of the reception in the bathroom, crying quietly into paper towels while trying to understand how we'd gotten back to this place of hiding and shame. Claire found me in the parking lot after the reception, her face stricken with guilt and regret. She reached for me, but I stepped back, still too raw from what I'd witnessed inside. "Nina, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "That I'm your dirty little secret again. That all the progress we made, all the courage you found was temporary." "It's not like that," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. My future, my career." "What about our future?" I interrupted. "What about the life we've been building together?" She looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and I knew I had my answer. In the hierarchy of her fears, losing her academic prospects ranked higher than losing me. The realization was devastating and clarifying in equal measure. We drove home in silence, the weight of unspoken words filling the car like poison gas. Back at my apartment, Claire tried to explain, to justify, to somehow make me understand that her love for me was real even if her courage wasn't consistent. But I was tired of understanding, tired of making myself smaller to fit into the spaces she was willing to give me, tired of being loved in secret, in shadows, in the margins of someone else's carefully curated life. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, the words tearing my throat raw. "I can't keep being your part-time girlfriend, your sometimes love, your when it's convenient relationship." "That's not fair," she protested. "You know how complicated this is for me." "It's complicated for me too, Claire. Do you think it's easy loving someone who's ashamed of me?" "I'm not ashamed of you. I'm ashamed of myself, of my cowardice, of the fact that I can't seem to choose love over fear consistently." Her honesty was brutal and beautiful, but it wasn't enough. Love without courage is just wishful thinking, and I was tired of living in the space between what we had and what we could have if she'd just let us. Claire moved out of my apartment gradually, over the course of a week. She'd come by when I wasn't there, taking her books and clothes and the small domestic items that had made my space feel like ours. Each day, I'd come home to find another piece of our shared life missing. Her coffee mug from the kitchen counter, her reading glasses from the bedside table, the photo of us from last Christmas tucked into my mirror. She left notes, small apologies and explanations scattered throughout the apartment like breadcrumbs. I found one pressed between the pages of Mrs. Dalloway. "I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer. You deserve someone braver than me. Someone who could love you in daylight without flinching. I hope someday you find her." The note made me angry in a way her absence couldn't. She was martyring herself, making this about her inadequacy instead of her choices. She wasn't too cowardly to love me properly. She was too committed to a version of safety that required my erasure. I threw the note away, then retrieved it from the trash an hour later, smoothing out the wrinkles and pressing it back into the book. Even in my anger, I couldn't bear to lose the last piece of her handwriting, the final bookmark in our story. My friends rallied around me with the fierce loyalty of chosen family. James brought ice cream and let me cry on his shoulder without offering platitudes about fish in the sea. Oliver helped me rearrange my furniture, understanding instinctively that I needed to change the geography of my space to make it bearable again. But even surrounded by love and support, I felt hollowed out, like someone had reached into my chest and removed something essential. I'd lost more than a girlfriend. I'd lost the future I'd been building in my mind, the life I'd started to take for granted. Spring turned to summer, and I threw myself into finishing my thesis with single-minded determination. The irony wasn't lost on me. Writing about queer subtext in literature while my own love story had been forced back underground. But the work gave me purpose, Something to focus on besides the Claire-shaped absence that seemed to follow me everywhere. I still worked at the library, though I'd switched today's shifts to avoid the evening hours that carried too many memories. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her across campus, always alone, always hurrying somewhere with her head down, as if she were trying to make herself invisible again. Dr. Henderson had gotten her wish. Claire was accepted to 3 PhD programs, including Yale, where Dr. Peterson had been impressed by her dedication to her work. The gossip network of graduate school kept me informed despite my attempts to avoid news about her. She was thriving academically, publishing papers and presenting at conferences, becoming the kind of scholar she'd always dreamed of being. I tried to be happy for her, but mostly I felt a profound sadness for the person she'd had to become to achieve that success. The Claire I'd known, the one who cried over Virginia Woolf and held my hand like it was a lifeline, felt like a ghost, a beautiful haunting that I couldn't quite shake. My abuela called one evening in July, her voice warm with concern. She noticed my sadness during our recent conversations, the way I deflected questions about my love life and future plans. "Mija," she said gently, "heartbreak is not the end of the story. It's just the end of one chapter." "What if it was the best chapter?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Then you're lucky to have had it," she said simply, "and unlucky if you think it's the only good chapter you'll ever write." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. I began to understand that grief isn't just about losing someone. It's about losing the version of yourself that existed in relationship to them. I was mourning not just Claire, but the Nina who had been loved by Claire, who had felt brave and beautiful and completely seen. I defended my thesis in early August, standing before a committee of professors and arguing for the importance of recognizing hidden narratives in canonical texts. The defense went well, and afterward, Dr. Williams, my advisor, pulled me aside. "You've done excellent work here, Nina. Have you thought about what comes next?" I had actually. While Claire had been chasing her academic dreams, I'd been quietly applying for jobs at small liberal arts colleges, places where I could teach literature to undergraduates who were still figuring out who they wanted to be. It felt like the right kind of work for someone who understood the power of stories to help people find themselves. "I have a few offers," I told her. "I think I'm going to take the position at Middlebury. It's a good fit." Dr. Williams smiled. "Vermont will be lucky to have you. When do you start?" "September. I'm moving up there next week." The decision to leave felt both necessary and heartbreaking. This campus, this city, this life. It was all wrapped up with memories of Claire, with the ghost of what we'd almost had. I needed distance, needed to find out who I was when I wasn't defined by loving someone who couldn't fully love me back. My going-away party was small but perfect. My closest friends gathered in James's apartment, sharing stories and promises to stay in touch. As the evening wound down, Oliver handed me a wrapped package. "For your new adventure," he said with a smile. Inside was a first edition of Orlando, Virginia Woolf's novel about transformation and the fluidity of identity. On the title page, he'd written, "For Nina, who taught us all that love is worth the risk, even when it doesn't end the way we hoped." I hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by the generosity of chosen family, by the way these people had held space for my heartbreak. Vermont in September was a revelation of color and possibility. The campus where I'd be teaching was nestled in rolling hills that were just beginning to turn gold and crimson, and my small faculty apartment overlooked a valley that seemed to stretch toward infinite horizons. Teaching felt like coming home to myself. My students were eager and thoughtful, hungry for the kind of discussions about literature and identity that had sustained me through graduate school. I found myself sharing not just academic knowledge, but hard-won wisdom about the courage it takes to live authentically. One of my favorite classes was Queer Voices in Literature. where we read everything from James Baldwin to Audre Lorde to contemporary writers who are pushing the boundaries of how we think about love and identity. The students, many of them still figuring out their own relationships to queerness, brought an energy and honesty to our discussions that reminded me why literature matters. It was during one of these classes, while we were discussing the price of salt, that I realized something had shifted in me. I could talk about love and loss and the complexity of coming out without feeling like I was bleeding all over the classroom floor. The wound that Claire's leaving had opened in me was finally beginning to heal. I started dating again, tentatively at first. Coffee with a professor from the art department, dinner with a librarian from town, drinks with a writer who was doing a residency at the college. None of these connections developed into anything serious, but they reminded me that I was capable of feeling attraction and interest for people who weren't Claire. More importantly, I was learning to enjoy my own company again. I took long walks in the mountains, cooked elaborate meals for one, read books that had nothing to do with my academic work. I was rebuilding myself from the inside out, creating a life that was full and meaningful even when I was the only one living it. I'd been in Vermont for almost a year when I got the email. It was late on a Thursday evening in May, and I was grading final papers when my phone chimed with a message from an address I'd memorized but tried to forget. Claire.Davidson@yale.edu. My hands shook as I opened it, unsure whether I wanted to read whatever she'd written or delete it without looking. In the end, curiosity won. Dear Nina, I know I have no right to contact you after the way I ended things, but I heard through the academic grapevine that you're teaching at Middlebury now. I wanted you to know how proud I am of you, how unsurprised I am that you're changing students' lives the way you changed mine. I'm writing because I've been thinking about us a lot lately, not in a way that expects anything from you, but in a way that requires honesty. I need you to know that losing you was the worst mistake I've ever made, and not because I was lonely or regretful, but because I finally understood what I'd thrown away in the name of safety. You were right about everything. I was choosing fear over love, reputation over relationship, other people's comfort over our happiness. I told myself I was being practical, but really I was being cowardly. I finished my first year at Yale this week. It's everything I thought I wanted: prestigious, challenging, full of opportunities for the kind of career I've always dreamed of. But I'm miserable, Nina. Not just sad or stressed, but fundamentally, existentially miserable. I wake up every day and pretend to be someone I'm not. And I go to bed every night remembering what it felt like to be loved for who I really am. I know it's too late for us. I know I burned that bridge so thoroughly that there's no rebuilding it. But I needed you to know that you were right and I was wrong. And every day I don't get to love you is a day wasted. I hope Vermont is treating you well. I hope you're happy. I hope you found someone who deserves the incredible gift of your love. Always, Claire. I read the email 3 times before my vision blurred with tears. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but tears of recognition and loss and something that might have been relief. She'd finally found the courage to tell the truth, even if it was too late to matter. I saved the email to a folder I created called Closure and tried to return to my grading, but the words on the student papers swam before my eyes, and I found myself thinking about second chances and forgiveness and the difference between love and timing. I didn't respond to Claire's email immediately. Instead, I carried it with me like a puzzle I couldn't solve, turning it over in my mind during walks and quiet moments. Her honesty was complete and devastating, but it raised questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. Did her recognition of her mistakes change anything? Did the fact that she was miserable without me mean we were meant to be together? Or was this just another form of the same selfishness that had driven her to choose safety over love in the first place? I talked to my therapist about it, Dr. Sarah Gabriella, a wise woman who'd helped me navigate the worst of my heartbreak and the slow work of rebuilding myself. She listened without judgment as I read the email aloud, my voice catching on the parts that hurt most. "What do you think she wants from you?" Dr. Gabriella asked when I finished. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe just forgiveness." "And what do you want?" That was the question I'd been avoiding. What did I want? To punish her for the pain she caused? To forgive her and pretend it never happened? To somehow find a way back to each other despite everything that had broken between us? "I want to understand why she's telling me this now," I said finally. "Whether it's because she's genuinely changed or because she's lonely and remembering our relationship through rose-colored glasses." Dr. Gabriella nodded. "Those are fair questions. How might you find answers to them?" I knew what she was suggesting, and the thought terrified me. But I also knew that I couldn't move forward with or without Claire until I had some kind of resolution to this chapter of my life. That weekend, I drafted a response. It took me 12 attempts to find the right tone. Not too cold. Not too warm, honest, but not cruel. Asterisk Claire. Thank you for your honesty. I can't pretend it wasn't painful to read. But I also can't pretend I haven't wondered what happened to you. Whether you were happy, whether you ever thought about us. I'm glad you're recognizing the choices you made and their consequences. That kind of self-awareness is important, even when it comes too late to change the past. You're right that it's too late for us in the way we used to be. Too much has happened. Too much trust has been broken. But I find myself curious about who you've become in the past year. Whether the Claire who wrote this email is the same person who told Dr. Peterson she was single while I stood right beside her. If you're ever in Vermont, let me know. Maybe we can have coffee and see if there's a way to be friends, or at least to say goodbye properly. Nina. I sent it before I could second-guess myself, then spent the rest of the weekend hiking and trying not to check my email every 5 minutes. Claire's response came 2 days later, brief and grateful. "I would love that. I'm driving back to Ohio for the summer next week. Would it be okay if I stopped in Vermont on my way? I promise I don't have any expectations beyond the chance to see you again, and maybe find some peace with how things ended." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in town, neutral territory that didn't carry the weight of our shared history. As the day approached, I found myself alternating between anticipation and anxiety, wondering if this was a mistake, wondering if seeing her again would undo all the healing I'd done. The morning of our meeting, I changed clothes 3 times before settling on jeans and a sweater that was nice, but not too nice. Put together, but not like I was trying to impress anyone. I arrived at the coffee shop early, claiming a table by the window where I could watch for a car. When she walked through the door, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older, more polished, her hair shorter and styled in a way that spoke of professional success. But there was something hollow about her, a brittleness that reminded me of how she looked during those first months in the library, before she'd learned to trust our connection. She spotted me and smiled, but it was a careful smile, the kind you give to someone you're not sure will smile back. As she approached the table, I stood automatically, and we found ourselves in an awkward moment of not knowing how to greet each other. Finally, she extended her hand for a formal handshake that felt both absurd and heartbreaking. "Hi, Nina." "Hi, Claire." She ordered her usual chamomile tea. Some things apparently never changed, and we sat across from each other, the table feeling both too wide and too narrow for the conversation we needed to have. "You look good," she said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. "Happy. Vermont suits you." "Thank you. You look..." I paused, trying to find the right words. "Professional. Successful." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I look like what I am. Someone who got everything she thought she wanted and discovered it wasn't enough." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the careful, guarded Claire I remembered. This was someone who'd learned to speak difficult truths, even when they reflected poorly on her. "Tell me about Yale," I said, settling into my chair. "What's it actually like?" For the next hour, She painted a picture of academic excellence wrapped in personal misery. The prestigious program, the brilliant advisor, the research opportunities that should have been everything she dreamed of, but also the loneliness, the exhaustion of maintaining a facade, the way success felt hollow when you had no one to share it with. I kept thinking about what you said, she told me, her hands wrapped around her mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth, about how I was choosing fear over love. You were right, but it took me months to understand what that really meant. What does it mean? It means I was so afraid of losing the approval of people who barely knew me that I threw away the love of the person who knew me best. It means I was so worried about hypothetical rejection that I created real rejection. It means I was a coward, Nina. And I hurt the most important person in my life because I couldn't find the courage to stand up for what we had. Her words were exactly what I needed to hear a year ago, and exactly what I'd stopped needing to hear 6 months ago. The vindication felt hollow, overshadowed by the recognition that we were different people now, shaped by different experiences and different choices. We talked for 3 hours, covering everything from her struggles with authenticity to my journey towards self-sufficiency. She told me about therapy, about slowly coming out to her classmates, about the painful process of learning to live with her parents' continued disapproval. I told her about my teaching, about the students who reminded me why literature matters, about the life I built that was smaller than what we'd planned together, but entirely my own. I keep thinking about that night, she said as our conversation began to wind down. The reception where I said I was single. I replay it over and over, trying to understand how I could have been so cruel. It wasn't cruelty, I said, surprised by my own certainty. It was panic. You were terrified, and you defaulted to the safest option. I understand that now, even if I couldn't then. Understanding it doesn't make it forgivable. I studied her face, seeing genuine remorse, but also something else. A need for absolution that I wasn't sure I could or should provide. Claire, I forgave you a long time ago. Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying anger was making me smaller. I forgave you for my own sake, not yours. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Nina. For all of it. For the hiding, for the cowardice, for the way I made you feel like you weren't worth fighting for. You were worth everything, and I was too scared to see it. I know, I said simply, and I'm sorry too. For expecting you to be braver than you were ready to be. For not understanding how terrifying it must have been to risk everything you'd worked for. We were both doing the best we could with who we were then. The acknowledgement hung between us. Not quite absolution, but something close to it. We were both different people now. Scarred by what we'd lost, but also shaped by what we'd learned. There was grief in that recognition, but also a kind of peace. As we prepared to leave, Claire hesitated by the door. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think we could have made it work? If I'd been braver. If the timing had been different. If I'd chosen love over fear from the beginning. I consider the question seriously. Thinking about the people we'd been and the people we'd become. I think we could have had something beautiful, I said finally. But I also think we might have needed to break each other's hearts to become the people we are now. Maybe the love we had was perfect for who we were then, even if it couldn't survive who we needed to become. She smiled through her tears, and for a moment I saw a flash of the Claire I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and wise and achingly beautiful. Thank you, she said, for seeing me, for loving me, for letting me go, and for giving me this chance to say goodbye properly. We hugged then, a real hug that lasted long enough for me to remember how perfectly she fit against me, how her hair smelled like the same shampoo she'd used in graduate school. When we pulled apart, we were both crying, but it was the kind of crying that comes with release rather than loss. I watched Claire drive away from the parking lot, her car disappearing around the corner that led to the highway. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of our conversation, settling into something that felt like completion. That evening, I called my abuela to tell her about the meeting. She listened with the patience of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that love stories don't always end the way we expect them to. "So it's really over now?" she asked when I finished. "It was over before," I said, "but now it's finished. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense, Mija. Some stories need an ending before they can become a beginning." Her words stayed with me as I settled into my summer routine. I had a novel to finish reading, gardens to tend, lesson plans to prepare for the fall semester. The ordinariness of it all felt like a gift, the privilege of a life that didn't revolve around heartbreak or longing, but around small daily choices and quiet satisfactions. A few weeks later, I was grading summer session papers when I got another email from Claire. This one was brief. "Nina, I wanted you to know that I'm transferring to UC Berkeley for my second year. I need to be somewhere that feels more like home, somewhere I can be myself without constantly fighting for space. Thank you for helping me remember who that self is. I hope our paths cross again someday, in a world where we're both exactly who we're meant to be. With love and gratitude, Claire." I smiled as I read it, feeling proud of her for finally choosing authenticity over prestige, for recognizing that happiness matters more than other people's approval. It felt like the ending our story had always been moving toward. Not the dramatic reunion I'd once fantasized about, but something quieter and more real. 2 years later, I was in my office preparing for a faculty meeting when there was a knock on my door. I looked up to see a woman about my age, holding a stack of books and looking slightly lost. "Professor Garcia, I'm Dr. Sam Rivera, the new hire in the psychology department. I was wondering if you could point me toward the faculty lounge." She had kind eyes and laugh lines, silver threading through her dark hair. And when she smiled, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. The flutter of possibility, the recognition of someone I might want to know better. "Of course," I said, standing up. "I was just heading there myself. I'll walk with you." As we walked across campus, she told me about her research on resilience in LGBTQ+ youth, her excitement about teaching at a small college, her relief at escaping the publisher-parish pressure of her previous position at a research university. I found myself lingering in the conversation, asking follow-up questions, laughing at her dry observations about academic life. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" I asked as we reached the faculty lounge. "I could show you around town, introduce you to some of the local spots." "I'd love that," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about the strange circularity of life, how we sometimes find ourselves back where we started but with completely different perspectives. I thought about Claire, settled now in California, and hopefully finding her own version of happiness. I thought about the Nina who'd fallen in love in a library, who'd learned to speak her truth, even when it cost her everything she thought she wanted. But mostly I thought about tomorrow's coffee date, about the possibility of writing a new story with someone who'd also learned that love requires not just feeling but courage. Someone who understood that the most profound connections happen when we're brave enough to be fully ourselves, even when that self is complicated and scarred and still learning how to love without fear. The silence in my apartment wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, pregnant with all the words we hadn't yet spoken, all the stories we hadn't yet shared. And for the first time since Claire had walked out of my life, I found myself excited about what came next. Because love, I'd learned, isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about becoming someone who's complete enough to love fully and be loved in return. It's about having the courage to remain open to connection, even after heartbreak. To trust in the possibility of happiness, even when you've learned how fragile it can be. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, to Claire, to my younger self who'd been brave enough to love someone who couldn't love her back properly. That pain had taught me what I needed to know about my own worth, my own strength, my own capacity for resilience. And tomorrow, I get to find out what I'd learned about my capacity for new beginnings.